Trials were a complete success. It's too soon to say, but they could be the key to everything. It's time now to begin Phase 2.
Hello, and welcome to Film Rant. This time we review Maze Runner, The Scorch Trials, directed by Wes Ball. I've seen the first movie, but I've not read the books, so some criticisms I have of this movie may be answered in the books or later on in the story. Yes, I'm one of those filthy casuals who like seeing these movies without reading the source material, but to be perfectly honest, when I read books I mostly get so bored that sticking my dick in a dead pig might seem like a good idea. As usual, this review contains all of the spoilers, for Maze Runner, The Last of Us, Doctor Who and The Walking Dead Telltale game. Now I know that's a lot of spoilers, so watch the movie and Doctor Who and play The Walking Dead and Last of Us. Seriously, even if you're not a gamer, play that game, it's fucking awesome. Then come back and watch this review. Let's start with the characters, and why not talk about Thomas first? He's pretty much the same as he is in the first movie. There's not much character development for him. He's very likeable but extremely two-dimensional. Everybody seems to think he somewhat stands out, but I don't really see how. He's slightly inquisitive and a bit brave, but that's about it. All of his friends are pretty much equally as brave by this movie, so that made him stand out even less. One of the biggest gripes I have with him is he doesn't seem to know what his objective is. He's happy to stay at Wicked until he finds out what they're doing, then decides to leave, and for most of the movie has no idea what to do. I suppose he's trying to find the right arm, but then what? He has no plan, and it makes him appear to be a weak leader. He also doesn't seem to understand the world he's in. Yeah, Wicked are a bit sketchy, but they outright tell him, "Mate, you're going out there and you're going to get fucked by clickers or the mighty wrath of Thor," and he's like, "Nay bother pal, I'll wear me raincoat." He's just not fazed by the fact that the entire planet has gone to shit and he is in mortal danger every second he's out there. He's a decent enough protagonist, but his character really needs to be spliced open a bit more. Give him some really hard decisions, give him some points where he can show how allegedly outstanding he is, dive into his past a bit more. Though I know that last one is difficult because of the memory loss thing, but I would still like to see it. Teresa, played by that bird from Skins, is sort of made out to be the key to the whole story, in both the first movie and this one. Everything you hear about her seems to point to something huge, that she's going to be a massive pivot in this crazy plot. But the film really doesn't give her much screen time, at all, in the entire movie. I feel like if someone is being set up to be a huge character, then she should be shown as a sort of co-protagonist with Thomas, but she's just so underplayed. What's even more confusing is that she's sort of made out to be the villain as she betrays the group at the end, but to me she's the only one out of the lot of them that actually has any sense, but more on that later. Littlefinger, or in this film Jansen, is the main villain of the movie. Now I think this guy is casted purely because they thought, this fella needs to appear good but a little sketchy at the same time, a bit like Baelish from Game of Thrones, and someone said, well, let's just get him then. It pays off, he does a great job. But he isn't really in the film enough considering he's the main face of the enemy, which is Wicked. I think we needed to see more of Wicked in order to truly display them as the alleged evil do-gooders they are. Think of Star Wars. Imagine we see that scene with Darth Vader interrogating Princess Leia in A New Hope. Then the rest of the movie we just hear her and Luke saying that Darth Vader and the Empire are a bunch of bastards like they're proper nasty. Everyone takes the word for it and nobody questions why. We also don't see any more of the Empire or Vader throughout the movie, except when they think they've found the rebel scum and Vader just sits there in his TIE fighter while everyone else does the work. That's what it's like in the Scorch Trials. Wicked needed to have some of their own scenes. Watch Dr. Page experiment on the young people or watch Jansen abduct little kids for experimentation. Really villainize them. Maybe I'm missing the point because the whole story hasn't been told yet. Maybe Wicked are actually not meant to be that bad. Maybe they'll pull a switch near the end where it turns out Wicked were the good guys all along. I've got a lot to say on Wicked actually, but we'll talk about them when I get into the script. The most interesting character for me was Jorge. Again though, he doesn't come into the movie until very late, so he doesn't have much time, so I was left wishing to have seen a bit more of him, but at least I've got the sequels to look forward to. He seemed to be one of the few people who actually had a plan and knew what was happening in the world. He also seemed to enjoy the fights and be fairly ruthless when it came to meeting anybody he considered his enemy. The movie needed this kind of strong leader character, as Thomas slightly falls short. As for Thomas's friends, they're pretty run-of-the-mill. That other Game of Thrones actor plays Newt, the guy that constantly tries to stop Thomas and make him think about what he's doing before giving up when Thomas looks at him and says, "Say what you like pal, I'm not gonna listen." Mino is fairly run-of-the-mill too. He has a deeper connection with Thomas and the audience because he was Thomas's sidekick in the first movie, but becomes background in this one. He doesn't really have much to say. In fact, everyone including Thomas must be big fans of Friends because they all seem to only say one thing. and that seems to be the running theme throughout the film series. I'm not sure if it's a big point in the books, but in the movies it seems to be the central theme. Which brings me nicely onto the script, so I'll jump right in and talk about the plot itself. Now, some of the issues I have I'll assume are also present in the books. Maybe I'm wrong, but the movies may miss out or change some things, but ultimately the plot is the same, right? My biggest issue with the plot is, why does the right arm or Thomas and friends want to attack Wicket? Okay, we see they get some of the young immunes and harvest them to create the half-cure type thing. Dr. Page says she wants to find a cure, by any means necessary, and I actually believe her. Okay, Wicked's methods are far from ethical, but I don't think anybody noticed the world has gone to complete fucking shit. If she truly believes that she can cure the world by sacrificing a few of these young immune people, then I'd be willing to take that risk. Yes, it would be better if her organisation asked for volunteers, but how many people would really do that? She's taking charge and being the bad guy for the good of everyone. It's similar to this scene in Doctor Who. Now, for you Whovians out there, I apologise because the details of this may be sketchy, as I've never seen the episode but I've heard about it. Rory's girlfriend has died, and he asks the Doctor to go back in time to save her, but the Doctor explains that if he travels through time a bit too much it can fuck up the entire universe. Then this happens.
How many lives now never happened? All the people who never live. Your girlfriend isn't more important than the whole universe. She is to me!
Notice Roy's motivations, but the main hero of the story, the Doctor, is against him, as the audience also is. Similarly, remember that controversial ending to The Last of Us. So Joel rescues Ellie from the doctors who were going to engineer a cure by sacrificing her. She then asks him if it's true they really couldn't cure the world, and Joel lies, avoiding telling her the truth that he has selfishly robbed the world of the cure because he sees this girl as his own daughter and is blinded by his unconditional love for her.
Swear to me that everything that you've said about the Fireflies is true.
I swear.
Okay.
It's a controversial ending because most players didn't side with Joel in that moment. Joel did something that players had no control over. The common denominator here is that both characters are played to be the antagonists because they chose or wanted to choose their own selfish desires over that of the entire world or universe. That's where the Maze Runner falls apart. As I mentioned earlier, it has the theme of friendship throughout both movies. One of the first things the guys say to Thomas in the Glade is, "We have each other's back." Thomas takes to this very strongly and tries to rescue Albie and eventually ends up in the maze. This heroic trait then flows into the next movie. He tells the group that they all stick together, nobody gets left behind. Eventually, when the ending comes and Minho is nabbed by Wicked, Thomas takes it upon himself to attack Wicked head on to rescue his friend. Then that's where the film ends. I must be the only guy in the world that sides with Teresa. Teresa spends a few seconds of the film trying to convince Thomas that they need to let Wicked do their thing for the greater good, which he totally ignores. His actions are similar to that of Joel and Rory. He's trying to save people for his own good rather than the good of the entire planet. The only difference is, Joel and Rory are made into antagonists in that moment, whereas Thomas is played out to be the uprising hero like Katniss Everdeen. There was a brief moment in the final minutes when he says he's going to attack Wicked and Newt questions him on it. I thought, finally, his group have come to their senses. They're going to tell him to just let Wicked be and move on into the right arm sanctuary. But no, in typical Newt fashion, he's totally swayed by Thomas pretty much saying, "No, we stick together, no matter the circumstances." Thomas's heroic deed to protect all of his friends works very well in The Maze Runner, as there's nothing else at stake other than his friends and guys in the Glade. He takes it upon himself to free them from the vicious grievers, but when there's something much bigger at stake, like in the Scorch Trials, he comes across as a blinded and arrogant leader. I don't know if in the books the story is meant to be like this, and in the end he comes to his senses and Wicked win or something, but it's just difficult to get behind a guy who would actively see the world stay absolutely fucked just so he could have his posse together. A fault with this individual film though was, like Thomas, it seemed to not really know where it was going for a lot of it. The plot seemed all over the place. It has a runtime of 2 hours and 12 minutes, which seemed very long. In fact, for a lot of the film I thought it was going to end and then it just went on and on and on. Don't get me wrong, the film is actually quite entertaining. It just seemed to have no real direction and it was difficult to see what the ultimate goal was. One major gripe for me was that the characters didn't seem to ask many questions about the whole world they're living in or about certain people's motivations. Considering they've all had their memories wiped, you'd think they'd have quite a few questions to ask. Yeah, Thomas is quite inquisitive and asks some things about Wicked, but he doesn't ask anything that the audience are thinking. I have a whole questions section later. But when finally someone does ask a question, nobody in this film gives a fucking straight up answer. I wanted to pull my hair out. It was like watching a 2-hour long question time. All these kids would be A+ politicians as they can avoid questions like a banker avoids tax. There's one point where Thomas and friends meet up with some members of the Right Arm, which the audience, or them, do not yet know. The group ask Thomas to go with them in their jeep. Thomas asks, "Are you taking us to the Right Arm?" And the lovely young lady replies, "You'll see." Turns out that's exactly what they were doing. When Thomas asks that question, neither group is acting hostile towards one another, so why not just answer the fucking question? It seemed like the plot avoided answering questions to try and keep some of the mystery that this movie so desperately lacked in comparison to the first one. I think that the films needed to set up the world much better in order for us to fully understand what is going on. Instead of recapping the end of the Maze Runner 1, I'd have liked to see some kind of Attack on Titan style exposition animation at the start. Okay, it's exposition, but at least it's clear and concise what happened. I'd love to know what caused the Scorch, where the infection came from, what it does and how many people were affected. The film gives you little snippets of these things, but it's never truly served to you on a plate. Maybe the world is much better realised in the book, and the film has majorly failed on that part. The movie is also fairly devoid of strong emotion. It has a good attempt to wrangle some form of sadness in the audience, but it never quite succeeds. In the first movie, it had quite a touching moment when Chuck died at the end, but it was something you could see coming as soon as Chuck asked Thomas to hand the little model to his parents. The lack of shock made the death a bit predictable, but it was still sad. In the Scorch Trials, the movie tries to evoke some kind of emotion in the death of Zayn Malik. It tries to take a leaf out of the Walking Dead's book and have him infected before he actually is forced to kill himself. The only difference is, when we see it in The Walking Dead, we've spent a lot more time with Lee than we have seen of Zay. His actual name is Winston. So when it happens to Lee, it's far, far more tragic. I fucking broke down in this scene from the game. It was the proper way to do emotion. What happens to Winston, while tragic, is utterly pointless to the whole story. He's a new character, he's given barely any screen time, and he's not pivotal in the story at all. So when he died, I simply thought, oh well, bad news for that guy, but let's move on. When Lee died in The Walking Dead, I wanted to bawl my eyes out and care for Clementine myself. If they wanted to make Winston's death emotional, they needed to show much more of him in the run-up to it. Now we'll get to the fun part of the review. Who wants to be a Maze Runner heir? Yes, it's a very inventive and original name. I'm going to list a few of the questions I have about the overall plot, and you can try to answer them. If these questions are answered later in the series or are answered in the books though, attach a spoiler tag before writing the answer. Okay, let's go. Why not just put everyone in the maze? Where are the mazes? How are the mazes not affected by the Scorch? How did the older people survive? Are they immune? Finally, what was the idea of the maze trial? Now I'll elaborate on this one. It doesn't make any sense if they want to harvest young immunes, does it? Why test them? Just take them and harvest them. That seems to be what the plan was all along. The only reason I can think of that they didn't do this was that they were testing them to try and work out a more effective way to treat the disease, maybe come up with a full cure. But why the grievers if that was the case? Why input something that can potentially kill all of these precious young individuals? Sure, put them in a maze and get them to solve it, maybe include a couple of non-lethal booby traps. That would give you the problem-solving data you seem to be looking for, without the potential death factor. The whole plot just doesn't seem to add up really. After the end of the first one, I let a lot of issues slide because I thought they'll probably answer them in part 2, but still, no joy. Maybe I'm just being too eager and the answers will come in either film 3 or 4, or maybe 5 if they split the last book into 2 parts. I dabbled on it earlier, but this film really lacked the sense of mystery that the first one had. Throughout the first movie, you're constantly guessing what is at the end of the maze, if they'll get through the maze, why they're in the maze, why only boys, up until Teresa shows up. There's so many questions, but the good kind of questions, that are pretty much all answered at the end of the movie. The build-up of the Maze Runner really pays off in the ending. While the ending wasn't perfect, it was something I didn't see coming, and it was a great way to end a film that held so much mystery. However, the Scorch Trials lacks that sense of mystery and is left feeling a little hollow by comparison. It's like the first movie would have made a great indie movie in its own right, but then the author, and the movies, took the story a little too far, and go into the whole post-apocalyptic world. I guess the book readers will have watched the first movie in an entirely different way, as they'd know everything, so there'd be no mystery. Then the Scorch Trials will feel like an equally good film, because that also has no mystery. I think the fault comes in that Wes Ball seems to have made the films assuming you've read the books, which mostly people have. But you have to make films accessible to everyone without prior reading. I think this is where Ball has screwed the pooch a little, and should have been a little bit more clear in his storytelling. I'm getting to this stage of the review and noticing all I've done is list a fuck ton of negatives. I did actually enjoy this movie overall. It's flawed as hell, but it was entertaining, and I'll see the next one to see where the story goes. I feel I owe to the movie to mention some good points. I thought that while the characters are a little too dimensional and flawed in some areas, they were an interesting mix. Not so much Thomas's friends, but Thomas, Teresa, Dr. Page, Jansen, Jorge and Vince all mixed to create a wonderful concoction of conflict. It's interesting to see how all of these characters interact. On their own they aren't so great, but together they are fantastic. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens between them all in the following installments. I also thought the zombies, or cranks as they are known in the Maze Runner universe, were a fantastic threat. It's not too often you get running zombies, so it was great to see. They were genuinely scary and you felt genuine fear and discomfort when the group were being chased by them. The way they were presented was very similar to the infected in The Last of Us too, but I'll talk about that by talking about the technical aspects of the movie. So, we'll get on to the parallels between the cranks and the zombies from The Last of Us. Firstly, I'd say their appearance is very similar. Yeah, most zombies tend to look the same, but some of the cranks have some deformities that are otherwise not there in most zombie media. It isn't quite the crazy deformation caused by the cordyceps, but it's a noticeable difference. The cranks also share the same clicking sound that the clickers have in The Last of Us. It's not necessarily the same, but it's still quite clearly an ominous clicking. They also share the strange habitats they create. Like the clickers, the cranks can be found attached to walls by plant-like organisms. Finally, the infection is also shown spreading via spores. I won't say that one media copied the other, but I think director Wes Ball took a lot from the zombies in The Last of Us and used their traits very effectively in this movie. I mentioned earlier that I didn't feel anything for Winston's death, but I would like to mention that I thought the shot when he died was very cool. Ball could have quite easily cut to the group standing over Winston when we hear the gunshot, or have one of the group do the deed. Instead, they leave him, and you think for a moment maybe he won't ever do it. Once it cut, I thought we'd never see or hear anything more about it. But as the group is silhouetted climbing over sand dunes, we hear the gunshot and the group stops for a moment. I really enjoyed that little sequence. It was very tastefully done. I'll end by saying the Maze Runner The Scorch Trials really isn't a bad movie at all. It's above average, but I think its biggest flaw is its overall plot, which may also be an issue in the books. I think the characters could be explored a little bit more in the movies and some things could be made more clear, but it's shot well, the CGI is decent, it's well edited and has some great action and chase scenes. I just hope the plot improves in the future installments, as I just struggle to see what the real conflict is in the series. I understand that Wicked have some pretty brutal methods, but ultimately they seem to be trying to save the entire human race. In every war there is collateral damage, and in the war against the infection, I can sort of side with them and their means to an end. Maybe the series runs with that idea. We have a hero in Thomas who has to accept that you can't save everyone, and for the good of humanity, he has to make a tough decision to let the alleged villains win. That would be a pretty cool way to end it, I think. The Maze Runner The Scorch Trials gets 3.5 frames out of 5. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Film Rant.
It's all just been part of their plan.
What do they want from us?
Thomas! The maze is one thing.